Amidst the blood-soaked ruins of Kyrenia, where Greek soil had turned to a crimson mire underfoot, Philip II of Macedon, the great conqueror, advanced with extreme caution. Around him lay the remains of the defeated coalition army, Athenians who had fled the field, and Thebans who had fought to their last breath. Yet, even amidst this horrifying scene of violence and destruction, the seasoned commander froze in astonishment. Before him, like fallen stars, lay 300 warriors. They were not scattered or broken, but arranged in impeccable formation. Their bronze-tipped spears still pointed menacingly towards the enemy, and their shields were interlocked as tightly in death as they had been in life. Each of these men had fallen defending his beloved, their bodies piled upon one another, their hands still intertwined. When Philip's general suggested stripping the fallen of their weapons and spoils, the king, who had just conquered Greece, did something no one expected: he wept. "May ruin befall any man who doubts the honor of these men," he declared, his words echoing across the hushed battlefield. He realized that something more than just a battle had transpired; it was a true revolution. These 300 warriors had rewritten the laws of war, not with superior steel or tactics, but with something far more radical: love itself, forged into a weapon. For 40 years, the sacred band of Thebes had been the most formidable military unit in Greece. They were not merely soldiers, but lovers, bound by a loyalty that rivaled discipline. It was this emotional bond, this fierce and unwavering love, that shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. They proved that courage born in the heart could crush even the most disciplined military machine. Now they were gone. But their story, often misinterpreted, twisted, and forgotten, was destined to forever change the world's understanding of valor, sacrifice, and freedom. 3 days later, as the morning sun illuminated the Acropolis, a rider burst into the Athenian agora. His cloak was torn, and his body was caked in mud and sweat from the furious ride. "The Spartans have surrendered," he gasped, collapsing against a marble column. Silence fell. No one stirred. No one uttered a word. Then someone laughed nervously. Spartans did not surrender. They died on their shields, and no other way. Such was their law, etched in legend and carved in fear. But now, that myth was shattered. On a sandy islet near Pylos, a scene unfolded, hitherto unseen in the Greek world. 292 Spartan hoplites, dropping their shields and spears, begged for their lives. Cleon, the Athenian general, whose controversial figure drew mockery even from his countrymen, had achieved what Persian armies could not: he took Spartans prisoner. This unprecedented event became a catalyst, beginning to erode the age-old fear of Sparta. Across the Greek world, from Syracusan feasts to Byzantine courts, a question echoed, full of disbelief and horror: if even the Spartans surrender, what else was a lie? The answer, it turned out, had always been on the surface, hidden beneath a thick layer of propaganda so skilled that it misled even the most perceptive historians. The triumphant Battle of Thermopylae, lauded as the pinnacle of valor, had been a catastrophe. A king had fallen, an elite guard had perished. Sparta's military system, forging warriors from childhood, was devouring itself, producing fewer and fewer soldiers with each generation, while civil society buckled under the weight of impossible demands. The Helots, Sparta's enslaved population, outnumbering citizens sevenfold, constantly teetered on the brink of revolt. The fearless Spartans, contrary to popular belief, slept with daggers under their pillows, terrified of their own shadows. Moreover, Sparta had not won a decisive victory against an equal opponent for over half a century. Sparta's glory had become a mirage, maintained by tactics of retreat, deception, and intimidation, tools of the weak, not the strong. At Pylos, this mirage dissipated. Behind the bronze armor, emptiness was revealed. And the eyes of the Greeks, once blinded by fear, began to open. What if Sparta wasn't invincible? What if it could be challenged and defeated? In the Boeotian polis, situated on fertile lands, a warrior and philosopher named Epaminondas asked himself the same question. But unlike the others, he wasn't merely going to exploit Sparta's weakness. He intended to create something fundamentally new, a force born not only from strategy, but also from love, intellect, and an indomitable will. Through the Athenian assembly, chained Spartan prisoners were paraded, like a trophy put on public display. Their once awe-inspiring crimson cloaks, symbols of martial prowess, were now pitiful rags. Their gleaming armor, which had reflected the sun's rays in days of glorious battle, had been removed, exposing pale, trembling flesh. For centuries, the Hellenes had passed down legends of the Spartans, endowing them with superhuman qualities, portraying them as demigods, tempered in the harsh fires of the agoge, impervious to pain and devoid of fear. However, gazing upon these emaciated survivors of the Battle of Sphacteria, with their extinguished gazes and pleas for mercy, the truth was laid bare in all its ugliness: Spartans were merely mortals. And human will, as is known, can be broken. Cleon the Tanner, once ridiculed for his populism but now elevated to the rank of general, savored the ensuing silence like a fine wine. "Tell them," he addressed the leader of the captives, a Spartan officer whose hands visibly trembled as he tried to raise them. "Explain to them why you chose to surrender rather than embrace a glorious death, as your laws demand." His reply echoed through the annals of history. "Because stones and arrows rained down from all sides," he stated. "Because we did not see the face of the enemy. Because we were deprived of the opportunity to fight back. A senseless death is not equivalent to a glorious death." In that tragic moment, the Spartan myth first collided with harsh reality. But Athens was not content to stop there. The captives were paraded through all the significant city-states, turning them into a living warning. Crowds flocked to gaze in silent astonishment at warriors who had once inspired terror. Children, knowing no fear, pelted with rotten fruit those who had recently struck terror into entire armies, and they flinched at every loud sound. News of what had happened spread like wildfire. If these were the best of the best in Sparta, what real power did Sparta possess? In Syracuse, playwrights staged one comedy after another, ridiculing Spartan cowardice. In Corinth, merchants who had previously paid tribute dutifully to Spartan allies ceased their payments. An empire founded on fear began to crumble before their very eyes. And as the cracks in the foundations of Spartan hegemony deepened, even Sparta's closest allies began to question its infallibility. The Thebans, once forced to fight shoulder to shoulder with the red-cloaked warriors at Thermopylae, began to grumble. If Leonidas and his 300 Spartans were so heroic, why did they leave their Greek brothers to die alone? Why was Sparta's greatest contribution to the Persian wars only one failed attempt to hold back the enemy, while others bore the main burden of victory? The heroic aura gradually faded, giving way to dry and merciless mathematics. And the numbers, alas, no longer added up in Sparta's favor. In the labyrinthine streets of Thebes, a different revolution was brewing. Young aristocrats, raised on narratives of Spartan hegemony, began to uncover the truth. They meticulously studied the unyielding phalanx, a wall of shields and spears that had remained unchanged for 3 centuries. They analyzed Spartan tactics, built on fear and tradition, on the suppression of innovation and reputation alone. They saw a system riddled with decay, a legend rotting from within. Among them stood Epaminondas, scholar, warrior, visionary. But he wasn't content with mere study. He was developing a new theory, as radical as it was risky. What if everything the Greeks believed about war was wrong? What if Hellas's most powerful army was, in fact, its most vulnerable? And what if no one dared to test this hypothesis, until now? And suddenly, the very earth shook. At dawn in 464 BC, Sparta trembled under the onslaught of a natural force over which it had no control. Olive oil in amphorae shifted. Temple bells rang with a ghostly echo. And then the mountains roared. A 10-minute bacchanalia ensued, 10 minutes that would forever change the face of Sparta. The earth heaved like living flesh. Chasms opened, swallowing homes. The Agoge barracks crumbled into ruins, burying the future of the Spartan army beneath their own training grounds. The elite gymnasium, the pride of the warrior caste, was instantly flattened, interring an entire generation of potential kings, generals, and leaders beneath marble and bronze. In less than a quarter of an hour, Sparta lost more of its future than in half a century of wars. But this was merely a prelude to what was to come. In the Helot quarters outside the city, where 200,000 enslaved souls had suffered for generations, the earthquake became not a tragedy, but an omen. A message from the gods. As soon as the dust settled, they mobilized. Not in protest. Not in rebellion. But for war. A war for liberation, conceived over generations. A war destined to end slavery or die trying. The Spartan garrison, already weakened by the earthquake, suddenly faced an invisible, all-knowing enemy. The Helots did not fight like desperate slaves. They fought as insurgents, intimately familiar with every weakness, every habit, every vulnerable point of their former masters. The Helot revolt, contrary to expectations, did not lead to chaos, but became the starting point for a meticulously planned strategy. This uprising of the oppressed transformed into a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. Using the rocky slopes of Mount Ithilme as an impregnable fortress, the Helots managed to form a semblance of a shadow state. They established their own governance, built a clear chain of command, and organized an effective intelligence network. Adapting harsh Spartan discipline to their own ends, they turned the very system that oppressed them into a potent weapon of resistance. Their tactics involved launching lightning-fast strikes and instantly vanishing into the mountain ranges. They successfully sabotaged Spartan supply lines, eliminated key officers, and spread news of their revolt throughout the Greek world, demonstrating that the Spartans could not even control their own slaves. With each passing day of this revolt, the myth of Sparta's invincibility lost its power. Athens, always ready to exploit any opportunity, began secretly supplying the Helots with weapons and sharing intelligence. Other Greek cities, long suffering under the yoke of Spartan dominance, watched closely and asked themselves, if the Helots could revolt, why can't we? Sparta found itself in an extremely difficult position. Suppressing the revolt would mean acknowledging its own vulnerability, while ignoring it would demonstrate powerlessness. For 17 long years, the rebels held their mountain stronghold, which became a living symbol of Spartan weakness and a daily humiliation broadcast across Greece. The end of the revolt did not bring victory to Sparta. Instead, negotiations were held, resulting in the Helots being allowed to leave their positions and establish their own city. No military actions, no conquests, just a quiet defeat, a wound that even the most skilled propaganda could not heal. The earthquake exposed a fatal flaw in the Spartan system. Their military machine, seemingly indestructible, stood on shifting sands. An elite class, numbering fewer than 8,000, was forced to defend their homeland, surrounded by enemies whose numbers dwarfed their own by hundreds of times. Every military campaign carried the risk of a new uprising, and every loss became an irreplaceable one. The illusion of invincibility was shattered. In military headquarters and royal courts across the Mediterranean, a new idea emerged, posing a far greater danger to Sparta than any enemy spear: what if fear no longer works? Far from Sparta, in a humble courtyard, beneath the shade of olive trees, a quiet man traced geometric patterns in the dust. Epaminondas was preparing for his moment. In the summer of 379 BC, as political disputes between Sparta and Athens overshadowed the twilight of their former greatness, a 40-year-old aristocrat named Epaminondas lived in Thebes. He spent his time in solitude, drawing enigmatic lines in the sand. To ordinary people, he seemed an eccentric oddball, spending precious years studying mathematics and music, preferring philosophical discussions to commanding armies. Yet, behind his contemplative gaze lay a storm of innovative ideas. Every mathematical proof, every note of Pythagorean harmony, and every line from Plato's works became, for him, a form of ammunition. Epaminondas wasn't merely passing the time, he was diligently sharpening a weapon whose power the world had yet to comprehend. The tipping point came at a drunken feast, where Theban veterans bitterly discussed yet another defeat at the hands of the Spartans. One of them, lamenting, remarked, We always place our best warriors on the right flank, but the Spartans do the same. Their elite forces invariably clash with ours, and the outcome is always the same: we lose. Epaminondas, setting aside his goblet, leaned over the table and traced a line in the spilled wine. "What if we stop playing by their rules?" he quietly suggested. Silence fell in the room. "What if we decide where to place our best fighters? What if we refuse to fight where they expect us, thereby neutralizing their advantage?" This was sheer heresy. For 3 centuries, Greek military tactics had unfolded according to an unwritten script. Phalanxes met in head-on clashes, the right flank attempting to outflank the left. Battles had become a kind of ritual, akin to religious ceremonies. However, Epaminondas proposed not just a new tactic, he suggested breaking this script entirely. "Imagine," he continued, raising his voice, "a column 50 men deep, breaking through the weakest point in their defense, while their strongest warriors remain helpless on the flank. By the time they realize what's happening, it will all be over." Mathematics was his passion. Traditional phalanxes, formed 8 ranks deep, were designed for a slow and attritional wearing down of the enemy. Epaminondas, however, studied the physics of pressure and the geometry of concentrated force. He understood that the same laws governing levers and lenses could be applied to living forces. By concentrating a blow at a single point, even the Spartan wall of steel could be shattered like fragile glass. But to implement this plan required not only new tactical solutions but also soldiers unlike any Greece had ever seen. Soldiers distinguished not only by courage and discipline, but by boundless devotion. And to achieve this, Epaminondas turned to a force no commander before him had dared to use: to love itself. In Plato's dialogues, Epaminondas discovered an innovative concept, eros, not a fleeting carnal passion, but a deep and all-consuming love between equals, representing a powerful force, a bond surpassing fear, and a loyalty stronger than law. He wondered if it was possible to transform love into something more resilient than iron, and to wield it as a weapon. Thus began the boldest experiment in military history. Epaminondas decided to form a unit of 300 warriors, comprising 150 pairs of lovers, who would train, fight, and, if necessary, die together. Each warrior would defend not merely a comrade, but the person he loved most in the world. The psychological impact of such a unit was expected to be devastating. Soldiers, driven not only by discipline but by fierce love, ready to lay down their lives for one another, were bound to throw the enemy into disarray. These warriors would rather choose death than the demise of their partner. This was not just a military reform, but a true revolution of the spirit. As winter set in, Epaminondas meticulously developed his strategy, using wooden models and geometric calculations to plan formations, compute angles, and predict the course of battles. He was preparing for a real war of blood and suffering. Thus, the sacred band of Thebes was to be born. Recruitment for the unit began at dawn, but it was no ordinary call to heroism. Gorgidas, a commander personally selected by Epaminondas, addressed the city's finest warriors with a speech no Theban general had dared utter before: "We are not merely seeking lone heroes, but pairs bound by a love so strong that they are willing to die for each other." A tense silence fell in the hall. In Thebes, romantic relationships between men had been celebrated in poetry and philosophical treatises, but no one had ever before proposed building an army based on them. The selection process was unprecedented in military history. It was not about physical strength or skill with a spear, but about trust and intimacy. Officers interviewed each pair, inquiring about how long they had been together, the depth of their bond, and whether they could rely on each other in the harsh conditions of war. What mattered was not just combat prowess, but a brotherhood of hearts, which was to become the most formidable weapon ever seen in Greece. Greece, the cradle of ancient civilizations, bestowed upon the world not only philosophical teachings and architectural masterpieces but also martial traditions steeped in legend. One of the first chroniclers of those heroic times was Pelopidas, a young aristocrat chosen as a commander not for his noble birth, but for his deep affection for his beloved. "We train not only our bodies," he later recalled, but our souls, striving for complete unity. When Lander threw his spear, Pelopidas had to be ready to catch it if it fell. When he raised his shield, Lander unerringly knew where protection would be needed. They learned to move in unison, as if a single entity. Two minds, beating in perfect rhythm, a heartbeat apart, yet inseparable. The warriors' training was harsh and grueling. Daily 18-hour training sessions, including synchronized drills, shared meals, communal sleeping quarters, and shared pain, gradually blurred the lines between the individual and the pair. The warriors didn't just fight side by side, they became each other's armor, breath, and steadfast support. However, the true genius of the sacred band lay not only in the emotional bond but also in tactical innovation. Within the phalanx, each pair occupied a specific position. The Erasts, the elder partner, was on the right, covering the Ereminos, the younger, with his shield. While traditional hoplites fought as individual combatants in a solid wall, the sacred band operated as a single, organic entity, where one's attack was covered by another's defense, and if one fell, his partner immediately took his place. It was poetry forged from bronze and blood. The first serious test was not long in coming, striking Thebes like a bolt from the blue. Just 6 months after the formation of the sacred band, Sparta unexpectedly attacked the city. The main forces of the Theban army were dispersed throughout the surrounding areas, leaving only the sacred band and a small, inexperienced militia guarding the city gates. Across the plain, glinting bronze in the morning sun, the red cloaks of Spartan hoplites advanced in impeccable formation. Facing them were 300 untried warriors, about to experience their first true battle, standing between legend and utter annihilation. No one believed they could hold out. However, what happened next irrevocably altered the course of Greek history. The sacred band did not falter, offer prayers, or wait for orders. The warriors charged into battle with a ferocity that astonished even their own commanders. They didn't merely fight, they unleashed a primal, terrifying force. The battlefield became a bloody slaughter. Spartan veterans, warriors who had once unflinchingly faced the Persian immortals, recoiled before the onslaught of these men, who loved each other, who became legends, men who knew no fear, scorned pain, and fought with the might of myth and the grace of dancers. The Spartans were forced to retreat. The sacred band achieved victory, but it was more than just a triumph of arms. It marked the collapse of the idea of Spartan invincibility. On that day, 300 devoted warriors rewrote the future, and it was only the beginning of their glorious journey. It all began rather prosaically. The route to Tegera seemed unremarkable. 300 warriors from the renowned sacred band were tasked with escorting a supply train through a narrow mountain pass in the heart of Greece. Pelopidas, hardened by countless battles and now in command, meticulously chose the route, aiming to avoid encounters with Spartan patrols, known for their elusiveness. However, on a sweltering summer day in 375 BC, scouts returned with news that sent shivers down their spines. 2 full Spartan Mori, numbering over 1,200 elite warriors, had taken up positions on both sides of the pass, trapping the sacred band. Tradition dictated surrender. All existing rules and precedents pointed to one conclusion: if the enemy forces outnumbered them fourfold and there was no path to retreat, a prudent commander should enter negotiations. But Pelopidas, gazing at the gorge and seeing the formidable bronze wall that awaited them, issued a completely different command. "We shall not die like cornered animals," he declared. "We shall face death as warriors who love each other." The warriors of the sacred band locked their shields, forming a formation 50 ranks deep and 6 men wide, standing shoulder to shoulder. And then they charged. The Spartan commanders couldn't believe their eyes. No one dared attack Spartans, especially in a narrow pass, with such overwhelming numerical superiority and without the slightest hope of success. But the sacred band was unlike other armies. They moved in perfect unison, their bronze-tipped spears thrust forward like a single fist. As they closed to 20 yards, they let out a war cry, not the cold, honed sound familiar to soldiers, but a cry filled with love, fury, and defiance. It was the roar of men who had already accepted their fate. The clash of the two armies was like a thunderclap. They slammed into the Spartan center like a battering ram, breaking through ranks that had previously withstood the onslaught of Persians and Athenians. It wasn't just about superior formation, it was about something far greater. The Spartans fought for their pride, while the sacred band fought for each other. The Spartan ranks wavered, and then, incredibly, faltered. The veterans of Thermopylae, warriors raised in an ethos of unwavering resolve, turned and fled. For the first time in history, Spartans fled the battlefield, defeated not by numbers, but by fury, unity, and love, which had become steel. News of the Battle of Tegea spread like wildfire throughout Greece. News of this unprecedented defeat swept across Hellas like the flames of a consuming fire. In the bustling agora, the noisy bathhouses, and the hushed whispers beneath temple eaves, the incredible news was passed from mouth to mouth: the Spartans had suffered a crushing defeat. And not by barbarian hordes, nor by the wrath of the gods, but by the hands of merely 300 warriors. Yet, these were no ordinary warriors, they were lovers bound by sacred affection. In philosophical discussions at symposia across the land, the former certainty of Spartan invincibility began to crack. If love could overcome iron discipline, what else might crumble under its onslaught? However, the sacred band did not stop there. They had struck a painful blow to Spartan pride, but its body still breathed. To finally slay it, they needed to strike at its very heart. And so, in the fateful year of 371 BC, Epaminondas led his army on campaign. On the plain of Leuctra, 11,000 Spartans and their allies drew up, confident in their unshakable strength. They stood in the traditional battle formation that had for centuries ensured their dominance over Greece: heavy infantry on the right flank, allies on the left, cavalry on the wings. Facing them waited merely 7,000 Thebans. To the Spartan king Cleombrotus, this battle seemed an easy stroll, a harbinger of another glorious victory. But Epaminondas had an ace up his sleeve. Hidden within the Theban ranks, masked by dust and strict discipline, lay a military innovation he had honed for years: the oblique order. A daring diagonal assault. A concentrated blow of full force at a single point of the enemy line, like a blade aimed directly at the Spartan elite. And at the spearhead of this deadly blade stood the sacred band. When the trumpets blared, and the two armies surged towards each other in the ancient dance of war, the Theban right flank began to retreat, as if by a pre-planned script. The Spartans let out a triumphant roar, convinced that the enemy was already broken. But they were gravely mistaken. It was merely a clever military ruse. The Theban phalanx pivoted, like a door swinging open on unseen hinges. And at that moment, the sacred band crashed into the Spartan right flank with the force of a bronze avalanche. This was not a ritualistic duel, but a deliberate annihilation. Cleander and Theron, renowned veterans of the Battle of Tegea, tore through the Spartan front. When Theron was mortally wounded, Cleander cast aside all caution to punish the enemies surrounding him. Around them, 298 other warriors fought with the same fury, the same indomitable passion. When Cleombrotus fell, the Spartan king, who for the first time in 3 centuries met his death in open battle, with him, the myth of Spartan invincibility crumbled. Sparta suffered a crushing defeat. The invincible army scattered like a frightened herd. The sacred band did not merely win a battle, it marked the end of an entire era.